conversation around adoptive, kinship, foster parenting issues with Dina Shelton and Marissa Sanders. And let's see where the conversation takes us today.
Yeah, so I think we were talking about how one challenge for kids who are still in foster care, or for foster parents, talking with them, is when they start to talk about their trauma, or another difficult conversation I hear from families a lot about is, how do you tell a child if their parents' rights have been terminated, or visit changes are happening, or we thought there was going to be a visit with mom today and then mom canceled or mom didn't show up. Kind of dealing with those challenges when kids are still in the system and in foster care. So
yeah, and this conversation is always it always feels so big to foster and adoptive parents, because as adults we hold all of our knowledge of the child's trauma in our own minds, right? We know what they've been through. A lot of times we've read the documentation, we've read the paperwork, so we have this whole story happening for us in our heads that all feels very active in one place, because we know that the pieces of their trauma experiences can be affecting what's going on right in this moment, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's two pieces of this that I always like to map out a little bit, even developmentally for parents, to help calm some of that. Is that one, kids' brains work very differently than ours. Mm-hmm. And so where we always have all of the information in our minds, and we tend to be present in that moment with all of the stuff in our minds of, this could be an indication of something bigger. What am I looking for as an indication that I might need to talk to someone else? How do I do what's best for this child? What do I say or not say? What if I make it worse and trigger something? What if I don't say enough and then later they feel like I held things from them? It's like a never ending cycle, right, in our minds. Everyone who has had a foster adopted child in their home is going to know what that mind game is like. And so I always just like to I'm a lens backer first, and to kind of quell some of the anxiety surrounding that, is that a lot of that comes from a place inside of us that needs to be able to predict and control what's going on around us too. And it's driven by the right things. It's not a bad place inside of us that is not right. It's driven by our love and connection for these kids and our motivation to do right for them. But it gets a little bit off sometimes, because we have this idea that we can predict and control what's happening. We can look at what's happening with this kid. We can make the best judgment call and do the right thing in this moment. And one of the things that I always like to say for foster and adoptive parents is that everything's already wrong. And in most of these situations, there's not a categorical right thing to do or say, because the kid should never be in this situation anyway. So there's not a map for this. There's not a right way to get out of it. And that's not even the right framework that we can go into as parents, whether it's foster, adopt, or bio. We're driven to want to protect our children. And the truth is these kids have already not been protected. And that's a hard place for us, because because they've been exploited or neglected or abused, we want to offer them an even larger amount of protection. But that tends to push against our control, predict and control. Then we get wrapped up in our own head, our own performance, and it keeps us from being present. Mm-hmm. And so we get really focused on doing or saying the right thing, and it robs us of being connected to our child in the moment. And so I tend to work with parents and families on rerouting their idea of what's even needed in those situations. And to say, one of the biggest things is being able to pull back the anxiety. We set the tone for our kids. They may bring the content, and they may be bringing content that's big for us to carry, but we set the tone for them and how we connect to that information. And we even provide them a model of how they can interact with it. We can talk about hard things and it not be a complete disruption on our day or our emotions or our mentalities, right? Mm-hmm. So I have a few practicals with kids and families. It's all different, and we can go through a few different specific scenarios too. And so you may even have some examples yourself, but there are different ways of interaction depending on what the kid needs, what the developmental stage of the kid is, and what's going on. But I'll tell you 100% across the board, age appropriate honesty is always the right choice in every situation, all the time. age appropriate honesty is right. This has already happened to the kids. If the parents' rights are terminated, how, when, and what we tell them doesn't change the grief and trauma that results from that.
Right.
But being scared of it and backing away and getting in our own minds about our performance with that can make it more complicated for the kid. And it's not really about us, right? And so shaking off, one of the first things with parents is shaking off the anxiety of doing it wrong, really holding ourselves accountable for not making it about ourselves and staying out of our own heads and our performance-driven mentality that we tend to just fall into as parents, and it's cultural. And say, how do I do well for this kid who's already hurting? And I'm with them in the hurt. I'm not protecting them or preventing it. It's already happened.
I love the idea, Dina, of shaking off. And I'm guessing, if you're taken by surprise by a kid's question, you could easily buy some time and say, that's a great question. Give me a little bit of time to think about that. And I'm going to, get back to you, by tomorrow with the answer, and just give yourself some time. I'm wondering, Dina, could you say a little bit more about some examples of what age appropriate disclosure or answers would be, just off the top of your head?
Sure. And even different levels. One is not assuming that we know what the kid needs, right? We talked about this in one of the other videos about teaching kids to ask for what they need, which means we have to step back and stop trying to predict what they need and control it too. And so
like asking, why are you asking this question? What's important about knowing this right now for you?
And I'll give you a personal example. Actually, I'll give you an example of my son. My children were almost 4 and 6 when they were placed with us. And I think it was probably 2 years in. I was driving down the road. Zero things had initiated this conversation. All of a sudden, my son gasped, which scared me, of course. So I was already on, like hyperdrive because I had already been scared. And he said, I don't know what to do. And I said, what's going on, buddy? And he said, I just realized I used to know my biological mom's name and I don't anymore. And I'm a counselor. I'm working with families. I'm training people with this. And I'm like, I have no idea what to do right now. What do I say? I knew what her first name was. I knew that information. And in my head, I immediately went to, do I tell him? Do I not tell him? Do I give him information? Do I open this up? We're about to be some, and all of it was, how do I do the right thing? How do I predict and control this so that I'm not uncomfortable? And I just had to pause. And I'm a counselor, so we're a little practiced in this too, but it's the same process. I pause just like I do with clients a lot of times. This is not about me. This is not about my emotional reaction. What's actually happening here? And so we practice a lot of times just stopping and saying, what if I don't need to answer the question? We don't answer questions for clients as counselors most of the time. We just sit with them and be with them as they are exploring it, right? So I wonder what would happen if I did that with them. And I said, so I always say, you connect to the emotion. You don't connect to the content, you connect to the emotion with your kids. It's a really good way to help them learn what they need. And so I said, oh my gosh, that must feel really confusing the first time that you realize that your brain can let go of stuff that it used to know. And he said, yeah, it really is. I said, what do you need from me? He said, I don't think I need anything. I just can't believe that happened. And then he was 8, and then we moved on. I could have told him her name. I could have opened it. It wasn't we talk very openly, but that's not what he needed in that moment. It wasn't about her name. It was just about connecting to him as a person. So a lot of times, Sky, the honesty is about connection and not about content. So you've got to pull back from the content pieces and thinking that's what's driving the boat.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a beautiful example, Dina. And in the counseling world, we call that giving empathy. Right? We're making a reflection statement. We're reflecting back. We're taking in what they're saying, and we're imagining what would that be like to forget your birth mother's name. And we're kind of imagining the feeling of that, and then demonstrating that we're feeling with the person by saying it out loud. Wow, buddy, that must be so hard to have just made that discovery that you can't remember her name.
And it was probably about a year later that he asked, and he said, do you know my biological mother's name? And I said, I do actually. Do you want to know it? Yes, I do. So I told him, But that also goes back to that attachment cycle of when you ask, I will answer. But I'm not going to helicopter and predict your needs either. You're a person and I'm a person.
Yeah.
And so you get the space to be where you are, and I will just, and even like within that context, empathy being a portion of it, but I'll attune to what's going on with you. I'll tune in to what's happening and say, what's going on in you and what do you need right now? Not, oh my gosh, you're dysregulated, let me regulate you, because I can't handle your dysregulation. That's the message that ends up sending.
And let me ask you, Dina, I mean, you're in the counseling profession as well, so giving empathy and accurate attunement, this is the bread and butter of our profession. We came to this through training.
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing. I'm kind of curious, Marissa, how is this landing with you in terms of this Jedi mind trick of giving empathy to somebody who seems they haven't asked for a concrete answer, but the temptation would be to just give the answer.
Right. Oh, I feel like you guys are pulling back the veil on years of therapy for me. And I'm like, oh, that's what's going on there. And all of a sudden it makes sense. But yet it's like you just broke it down into steps that make it feel very doable and I'm thinking back to a conversation I had really recently with my son. And he's adopted, so forgive me if I'm sort of shifting gears here, but he was watching, our cat does this thing where she like licks fabric all the time, and a vet said, well, that could be because she was removed from her mother too soon. And he must have heard me say that because he was watching her do that one morning, and we were, just having family time, and he said, well, she was taken away from her mommy too soon. And that happened to me too. And then he started this narrative. He said, when I was in my mommy's tummy, the wind told me that you wanted a baby. And my first thought was, you talk to the wind? That's interesting. You can hear the wind. And he said, well, yeah, if you blow really hard and you move really fast, you can hear the wind. Okay. And then he went through this whole explanation about how the wind told him that I wanted a baby, and I wanted a boy baby and a gluten-free baby because both of us are gluten-free. And, he just connected that piece. And that's why he chose me. And he had all these, and because I liked your dress and you were pretty, and I chose you instead of this other person. And I, this whole narrative. And I kind of sat there going, I'm not really sure what to do with this. So I'm just going to go along for the ride. Like, I'm just going to listen and appreciate that he chose me. And, and then as soon as kind of he went off to do his other thing, I texted a friend of mine who was a child therapist and an expert in adoption. I'm like, is this normal? What does this mean? And I said, I'm assuming that it means, and she agreed, that he's trying to find a way that he has some control over this process. And it wasn't just something that happened to him, but that he made a choice. And she said, yeah, and he'll probably explore other narratives, and giving him the space, as he gets older, and giving him the space to do that is important. And I did say to him, well, did they take you from your tummy, mommy, because I wanted a baby? Because I wanted to make sure that wasn't his mindset, because that's always how I feel. Like, he's going to think that just because I wanted a baby and I couldn't have one, somebody else, they just took him away from his mommy because, I needed a baby. And he said, no, it was because she couldn't take care of me. And, he seemed to have a clear thought. And then he said that he missed her, and that when I said I would, we could look at trying to find her, he said, well, I think she died. And I remember with another child I had in care who was in therapy at one point, she was doing play therapy, and she said the babies couldn't find their mom. And so her conclusion was mom must have died. And the therapist said, well, that's she's processing that if you can't find your mom, then surely they must have died. So I don't know if that was part of his process, but I'm thinking back to whether there are ways I could have been shown more empathy, or, kind of had more of a dialogue, or if I just did the right thing by just sort of going along with the, I was like, I'm just going to go on this journey with him and see where it takes us. And, so.
When I hear stories like this, it always takes me back. I do a training for local families here in East Texas about the developmental nature of trauma. And it's something that I think is missed a lot of times especially when we hyper focus on trauma. And I'm hesitant. I struggle sometimes. I used to struggle a lot with saying things like this because I don't want to downplay the impact of trauma on on what's happening. But sometimes we hyper focus and trauma becomes the lens that we look through instead of things like development. As counselors, we have a developmental lens. We're always looking for normal development, where it is and where it needs to go. Even if it's delayed or it's not right on track or things are out of order, we're looking for development, right? So everything gets a developmental lens. But when we reroute and we get our lens with our kids of trauma, we see them through a trauma lens. We see the trauma first, and then that organizes everything else that we see, versus development and normal human development organizing everything. I'll give you an example. I had a friend who called me about her kid, and her kid was like 3. And he had picked up, and sometimes kids pick up like these just weird behaviors. And so he's spitting everywhere. And like belligerently at times, almost just like proving to everyone that he could do whatever he wanted. And she had done everything she knew. She said, I am like getting on my knees. I'm getting at his level. I'm talking to him just like, I have been trained to talk to him on the same level. I'm using words he understands. I've made it clear he's had consequences appropriate, and all this, and on and on and on. And she said, kid you not, the other day just this morning, we walked into his daycare and he spit on the floor. And she said, I took him away from everybody else so that it wasn't in public and not shaving. I got down on my knees right in front of him and I said, we do not spit. And before I got spit out of my mouth, he spit in my face. And she was like, I have no idea what to do. And so I tell this story a lot because this sounds really common, right? Marissa, how many foster and adoptive families do you know that could tell almost the exact same story?
Uh-huh.
The point of the story is that was her biological child.
Yep.
And when I tell that story to a group of foster and adoptive families, we hear it through a lens of trauma.
Yep. Yeah. You
Right?
automatically, what trauma caused that, triggered that, and what? Yep. Mm-hmm.
Nope. 2 parents, fully functioning, beautiful family, 100% fine. Second kid there were 3 in the family already, totally normal in every other capacity, 100% developmentally normal, frustrating as all get out. She was at her wit's end, just like any other parent. But when we have to balance between being trauma aware and trauma informed versus trauma lensed on our kids and look at their development. Kids build narratives for everything. It's their whole job to look at the world, to take in information and to create meaning out of it. They're constructing learning every day through mostly social interactions with family, friends, school, whatever else. This is part of their development. Our kids just happen to have this piece of life that other people don't, that they need a narrative for also. It doesn't matter what the narratives are most of the time, as long as they're not getting into real fantasy or they're coming back for me or they didn't do anything wrong. Those types of things that can counter appropriate process may need to have conversation, but otherwise just going along for the ride and not making it something different than it is beautiful to give to our kids, because that narrative is going to change too. My daughter did the same thing. She finality was a big deal for her, because some of this personality too. At some point she was like, oh, those people are definitely dead. And my son was like, I don't think that they are. And I had 2, and they're biological siblings. And I was like, no, I mean, as far as I know, no one has told me that. But I also don't give definitive answers, because I really didn't know either.
Right.
Nobody's told me that. So as far as I know, they're not. And she was like, no, pretty sure they're just dead. I'm like, what do I do here? Right? You don't know.
Right.
And in aftermath and in retrospect, looking back and realize they're creating those narratives. And so just one final piece on that, what we have to know is that memory, you get into psych and you look at brain and memory, when we understand and remember that memories aren't these fluid experiences where we kind of see the movie of what happened, and it's not a file cabinet where we go pull the same file out and take a look at it, put it back in, that every time our children think about their removal from their biological parents and think about this process, they are reconstructing it in their brains. They build the memory again. And every time we build a memory, we incorporate all of the things that we've learned from the last time that we built it till now into that picture as well. So if a kid has hit a developmental stage and suddenly they have the concept that if someone is missing, then they might come back or they might not. And the finality of if they don't come back, then they might just not be existent anymore. Then they build the memory or the narrative with that in there, completely developmentally normal and appropriate. The thing is we keep doing that as adults. You think about this, and I always like to anchor on the other side of how many people do you know who had issues with their mom? I think about all of the women who I've seen as clients and just friends, right? Who had issues with their mom. She's a mom and a daughter, and got into adulthood, figured out how to have good boundaries with them, set up a new system, like got over, forgave some things, moved past, and kind of got to a healthy place. And then developmentally, they changed because they had a child. And suddenly they rebuilt their whole childhood, understanding a mother's perspective. And suddenly some stuff that used to be a big deal doesn't even register anymore. And other stuff that never was a problem is. That's a developmental nature of trauma and issue. And we all do this. It's all part of our healing process. We rebuild. So every time a kid is reprocessing their trauma, I tell parents to celebrate they've hit a developmental milestone. That means that they've come full circle and they're doing it again. They've integrated everything they learned at the last stage, and now it's time to start again. And this just keeps going. It just keeps going all the way through life. And then we normalize that for our kids. You don't just get over it. You just keep learning and you keep integrating it.
Yeah, if you think about why we watch the same movie several times and how it feels different depending on what's going on in our lives, or if you're coming from a religious background, if there's a piece of scripture or a story from a religious tradition, how that story has different meanings for us at different points in our lives. I love what you're saying here, Dina, and it's also true for the parents, right? It's not one and done with a question like this. You could certainly, give the answer of the moment, and then, I'll do this with my kids. I'll be thinking about it at night. I can't sleep. And then I'll go back and I say, that thing we were talking about the other day? Yeah, if you want to think about your birth mother as dead, I'm just kind of, that's okay with me. How is that for you? Or, thinking about Marissa's thing, so, I was thinking more about that thing you told me about you and the cat. And I guess you and the cat are kind of the same in that way. Is that right? Does it feel good to have a buddy around that? That you both lost your birth mothers in a way, and so that you as a parent can keep recirculating that understanding as well. It's not like you have to have the definitive answer now, and then you're talking about it with friends a week later and you say, oh, I wish I had said this. It's not too late. You could still say it. Okay?
Yeah.
Hey, let's break here for a second, and then Marissa will pick it right up with you. So we're at a half an hour, so we'll just take a little break.